evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel, Jacob Simas, Assistant Editor for New America Media on the Census, and Laura Summons, Associate Media Producer with KQED's Quest series on the mothball fleet, and Tom Vacar, Consumer Editor with KTVU News on troubles in the commercial real estate market. Tom Vacar, there is a crisis, we know about that, in housing, but is the crisis in commercial real estate just as big?
In some cases, arguably, it's bigger because the consequences can have much more consequences to many of the banks. Let's take Silicon Valley for an example. In all of Silicon Valley, what we know is Silicon Valley is about 200 million square feet of usable commercial space. That would be factory space, office space, research and development, that kind of stuff. 200 million square feet. 43 million of it is currently vacant. That's just a little over 20% of that.
How many million?
43 million. It's huge. Of that 43 million, 4 million is brand new, never been used properties, just were built and they are just sitting there. Now, the other scary thing about that is that it is estimated by the folks who run the TARP program in Washington, D.C., that 50%, 1 in 2, commercial real estate mortgages will be underwater sometime in 2010. Now think about that. That's 1 in 2 commercial mortgages underwater. That means that there are some significant problems for those organizations to borrow money to keep those things going, and we're going to see a lot of repossessions. We are going to see a lot of bankruptcies. In fact, we're already seeing quite a few of those right now. And to give you a sense of how bad this has been, by October, which was the low point, property values down there had gone down 44% from the peak, 44%. So these are huge drops because these are cash flow dependent properties in many cases. The other thing that's happened is that during that last year, when there was very little loan money available, you could hardly get a loan. A lot of that stuff is starting to turn around. From the bottom back in October, we're now up about 6%. But to say that that's a repair is not a repair. We have a long way to go. And of course, what that is really indicative of is when they're empty, that means that people are not working, which is the core root problem of what's going on here.
That's what I was going to ask. Is it the high unemployment rate that is the real measure of this market's failure?
It's a lot, that to be sure, but it's also the high failure of business rate. It's also the extraordinary difficult problems that businesses are having borrowing money, a fear of investing in certain kinds of businesses because there is a fear that it may not turn out. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but at the root of it, of course, is unemployment, and that's one of the reasons you just don't have people in those buildings.
We've heard a lot about how residential mortgages and bad loans have affected the economy. I mean, what are people expecting with commercial real estate?
Well, when you were talking about possible losses of $300 billion this year, that could affect as many as 3,000 banks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to, just disappear, but the reality is a lot of banks are going to have to reserve a lot of losses, and those losses could fail some of those banks. Now, when we take a look at what happened with real estate, that was pretty much last year a real estate situation. With residential real estate, we lost 140 banks. I think we're over 40 already this year, so we may see more banks fail. Whether or not it will rise to that level remains to be seen, because the other cross current that's coming in here, which is extraordinarily important, is that the economy is picking up. A report just out, 162,000 new jobs. Admittedly, some of those census jobs, but this is the first real news we've had in 3 years of an increase in employment. If we can get that over 200,000 or up to 300,000 per month for at least a year, then a lot of our problems will be behind us, because government will have more funding, there will be more money available to be lent. But right now we are on this precipice, and we have to see which way it goes.
But with banks failing, I mean, those are jobs too. That's just taking the whole trajectory in a different direction.
Well, certainly in the recession, what we saw was many of the job losses were in construction. We know that. But besides construction, there were losses in real estate. There were losses in home financing and mortgages. Banks. So yeah, there's a significant problem here with loss of more jobs, but as I say, the other current is that many of the leading indicators suggest that things are getting better, and we do have to point out that employment and commercial real estate are lagging indicators. They're the last things that get repaired in an upturn, and what we're hoping is that that's going to happen reasonably soon, and then we won't have to worry so much about this. But there will be losses. There are going to be banks that are going to go under as a result of this, but whether or not it'll be as bad bad as the real estate crisis is not yet determined. One other thing I got to point out. What is kind of bizarre about all of this is that as we have, as individual employees who are still working, become more and more and more productive, there's less and less and less need to hire other people. So in a bizarre kind of way, we're actually working against our own interests, but that is the reality of what's going on in the economy right now.
Okay, what about the Obama administration? What are they doing? What's their plan? Have they already revealed what they plan to do?
Well, I think, one of the things you can bet is going to happen is these banks get into trouble, just as they did with real estate, residential real estate. They're going to go with their hand out to the government saying, you got to help us, you got to help us. And there's probably still a lot of sentiment in D.C. that we need to make sure that we don't have any major collapse, that we don't go into a double dip and all that stuff. So I think they're vulnerable to those kinds of things. But I think it's going to be a lot harder for these banks to make this case. And I think the other thing that's going to happen is that you're going to see banks taking back property and they're going to be running it themselves as opposed to just taking it and holding on to it. They're going to get these things managed. They're going to get these things, at some level of rent, because that's where the real issue here is how much can you charge? Rents are very, very reasonable right now if you want to rent office space pretty much anywhere in the United States. In Manhattan, for example, one of the most bulletproof markets in the United States, there's a 17% vacancy in Manhattan. That's unheard of.
Well, we move now to Jacob Simas. Well, it doesn't cost anything at all to turn in your census form, but your city or your state could be a real loser unless these forms are returned, right?
Sure. There's about $400 billion in federal funding tied to the census, which is allocated every year. So federal departments like the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the Department of Health allocate their resources based on census data. So in that sense, there's quite a lot riding on the census, and communities have a lot at stake. I think there's a couple issues when you look at the census. Two of the main issues being, number one, folks not returning the census questionnaire, and number two, some people not even getting the census questionnaire, which I think has been an issue that hasn't been spoken about enough. There's been a lot of emphasis placed on motivational factors, people having fear of the government, perhaps not trusting the Census Bureau, not wanting to fill out their census questionnaires. But there's whole other populations of people who, because they may live in non-traditional types of housing situations, may not even be getting that census questionnaire. So I think the big question when we start to see those returns coming in is going to be who's getting, who's getting the questionnaires and filling them out and returning them. What do those communities look like?
It's interesting you should mention that. I got an email and a call from a lady who lives in Berkeley, has a house, and she says, I didn't get my census form, and she's concerned. And when you put the calculation to it, Northern California's share of that pie that you talked about is about $20 billion. So if they're not getting the forms and they can't respond, what's the Census Bureau saying about that?
Well, they have a plan, and their plan is to, there's a second phase to the census. The first phase is the questionnaire phase, but the second phase is sending out about 700,000 people across the country who are going to be literally hitting the streets, going door to door, enumerating people, doing a head count based on who's not responding, looking at the tracks, the neighborhoods who are not responding, hitting those neighborhoods, going door to door. So that's what they're going to do.
So their fallback point is, we'll get to it when we get to it.
They'll get to it when they get to it.
I know this week in San Francisco there was an effort to count the homeless population. I mean,
Right.
what kind of difference does that make for a city like San Francisco?
It makes a huge difference. I can give you a very concrete example. Just a couple days ago, I was at Glide Memorial, which is one of the city's referral. It's actually the only homeless shelter referral center in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. And I was speaking to one of the workers there, and they were telling me how they've seen their population boom over the last 3 or 4 months, whereas people coming in for shelter referrals used to fill up their room. Now it's the line is spilling out onto the streets. There's people on Ellis Street, winding down. There's about $1 billion in HUD funding that goes specifically to emergency shelters. So it has a huge impact. There's a huge consequence. If these populations don't get counted, then they're not going to get the services. So stakes are high.
And California, the Bay Area in particular, has a large immigrant population.
Sure.
And those are particular challenges too. What about finding people who speak the language of the folks that you're trying to get those forms returned from?
Well, one of the approaches of the Census Bureau, again, I mentioned they're hiring about 700,000 people across the country. Many of those people are enumerators. And the idea of the Bureau is to hire from within the community. I think there's been some concerns that hasn't been happening to the extent that some people would like it to. But the idea of the Census Bureau is to tap into the community, to hire from the community so that the people knocking on the door are trusted faces and that people are seeing themselves reflected in the Bureau. Whether that's happening across the board is another question, but I think that's definitely the strategy.
What about the forms themselves? There are only 10 questions, I understand. Is that correct?
10 questions.
But
yeah.
there has been so much discussion and debate about those questions. Like, what's challenging about it?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think people have different concerns about the census. There is a pretty well-publicized boycott against the census with some in the Hispanic Christian congregation community. There was a really interesting poll that just came out yesterday from the Pew Hispanic Center, which showed that within the Latino community, actually, new immigrants were more likely to actually trust the federal government and fill out the census form. It was the people who have been here people who were born in the United States or who have been here for generations within the Latino community who were least likely to trust the Census Bureau when they say that your information is confidential. So I don't think it's about the questions per se. I think it's about trust and whether or not people are going to believe the government when they say this information is going to be kept confidential.
But isn't there some confusion about the checkoff as to whether you're Hispanic or not Hispanic and what is white and what is
sure.
not?
Yeah. Well, the Census Bureau, for anyone who has filled out the Census Bureau form and taken a look at the racial categories, it is confusing. There are some people who would say that the racial categories are off base. For example, if you consider yourself a mestizo person of mixed heritage, Latino from indigenous and Spanish heritage, which most Latinos are, there's no category for mestizo. You can check off Hispanic, but unless you fill in the boxes indicating otherwise, you're going to be counted as white. So that's been a big issue, and it's not only within the Latino community, but other communities as well.
The bottom line is, though, get those forms back. Your community needs you. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Well, we have something or some things that have been floating around our bay for a while that people have been trying to get rid of. And so, Lauren, that brings us to your story. What kind of agreement has been reached to move the mothball fleet out of Suisun Bay?
Well, it's been an agreement that's been a long time coming. People around the Bay Area probably know the mothball fleet. If you drive over the Benicia Bridge and just near Martinez, you can see that there's dozens of ships that are parked out there. And for the most part, they're retired Navy and merchant ships. Some served in World War II, some served in the Korean War. But now they've reached the end of their careers. They're waiting to be recycled. And the U.S. Maritime Administration is in charge of that process. The problem is, over the decades, the paint on these ships has cracked, it's weathered, it's actually fallen into the bay. And this is toxic paint. It has things like lead, cadmium, copper, zinc. Those are metals you don't really want getting into the watershed, especially a watershed like Suisun Bay, where there's critical habitat for endangered species. So a number of years ago, some environmental groups sued over the pollution these ships are casting off. The water board, the San Francisco Bay Water Board, also joined that lawsuit. And in January, the judge ruled that these ships are, in fact, in violation of the Clean Water Act. And that's what led to this week's settlement. It's actually a pretty aggressive settlement when it comes down to it. The worst 25 polluting ships are going to be removed within 2 years. All 52 of the ships that are waiting to be recycled, they'll be gone by 2017. So it's just a pretty aggressive timeline. They'll be moving out pretty soon.
Isn't there a concern, though, that some of these ships are so old, so decrepit, have not been to sea, have not been given the rigors of being at sea, that maybe it's not a good idea to take them out there's a danger they could fall apart in the bay and cause a problem, but worse, they get out in the ocean and they might not be seaworthy.
Well, that's kind of one of the interesting topics for this story is, should they even go to sea? The reason they're going there is that the nearest ship recycling facility is actually in Texas. So to recycle these ships, they're taking them outside of the bay, through the Panama Canal and all the way to Texas. For the most part, what I've been hearing is that they are stable enough, but what has to happen is they're going to dry dock in San Francisco to be cleaned. That's because before a ship can leave San Francisco Bay, you have to get the marine growth off to prevent the spread of invasive species. But that is one of the interesting things. A lot of people are arguing these ships should be recycled right here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, it seems that would employ a lot of people.
There's one company that's trying to open some dry docks in Vallejo, and they're estimating 100 or more.
They've been trying that for a very long time. Why have they not been able to do that?
Well, it's a former Navy facility. There's a lot of stuff to do to get it up and running again. It's been shut down for a number of years. Right now, they're kind of stuck in a bit of a permitting mess. There's some sediment that's actually blocking these dry docks, and it needs to be dredged. And as a lot of people know in the Bay Area, dredging sediment requires a lot of permits from a lot of different agencies. So they're a little bit stuck right now.
And so we will be seeing some of them in dry dock here in San Francisco too? Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And how long is this whole process going to take? There's about 50 ships in the bay, right?
Yeah, so these are pretty tight timelines. I mean, to get the worst 25 out in 2 years, that's pretty aggressive. And they think that they can do it, but it's going to be a logistical process. I mean, if they had a facility here in the Bay Area to actually do the recycling, a lot of people think it would happen faster.
And nobody wants to make a museum out of any of them.
Well, there are some ships out there. The USS Iowa is a pretty famous battleship that are looking for a place to be a museum. But these ships are, for the most part, ones that need to move on.
Okay, that's the mothball fleet.
Yep.
I want to thank all of you for joining us here tonight.